The hallowed shallows were crowded with rambling isles now, hundreds of them, some large, some small. They seemed to be waiting for something. Oliver waited too, dangling from the Thrillstone's brow, his glass globe swinging to and fro in its creaking basket of ropes. When would the judging begin? Stacy de Lacy was running about busily on the Thrillstone's head, shouting orders at his monkeys while they did a bit of last-minute polishing and tidied scraps of seawig that had been blown skew-whiff by the wind. At last, on the far horizon, a tiny speck appeared, drawing quickly closer. The islands all mumbled and muttered to each other, turning to look. Soon, Oliver could see that the approaching thing was another rambling isle, striding purposefully through the waves. On either side of it, the waves' crest foamed, and the foam took on the form of galloping horses. It was the chief island who had won the last night of the Seawigs. The white horses of the sea formed an honour guard for her, and the mermaids on the singing rock started to sing again, properly, now that they didn't have Iris helping. The chief island, her name was Damboulay, waded into the shallows and stopped. On her summit towered a massive wig of trees and flowers and grasses, with rainbows knotted in it, and the prows of Viking longships jutting out like ornate hairpins. She looked at her fellow islands with pride and sadness, and then quickly shook her head so that the old wig came apart, the rainbows drifting away, the rotten timbers of the old ships tumbling down her sides into the sea. "Ah," said the rambling eyes, and "ooh." Even the Thrillstone made a deep rumbling sound out of respect for Damboulay's wonderful wig. "Never mind," said Damboulay sadly. "It was a good wig, but it was old, and now I can start again and collect a whole new one. But first, we must see who here has the finest seawig. Which of us has found the prettiest things on their wanderings? Who shall the winner tonight be, and chief island for the next 7 years?" The islands shifted a little. The ones whose wigs were really poor, or had suffered in the wind, slunk backwards into deeper water. Some eyed up the drifting bits of Damboulay's wig that still bobbed upon the waves, wondering if they could make some last-minute changes without the others noticing. The prouder ones preened themselves, hoping to attract the votes of their neighbours. The island with the wig of drizzled sand drew many admiring looks. So did another, which had a crown of whale bones, but none could compare with the splendour of the Thrillstone, with its shipwrecks and those 3 glass globes, from which 3 captive humans gawped. One by one the islands turned until they were all gazing at it. Oliver, trapped in his hanging globe, pounded his hands against the inside of the glass and shouted, "No, it's not fair! The Thrillstone cheated!" But the mermaids were singing still, and their voices drowned out his protests. His parents waved and shouted too, but the rambling isles thought they were only pleading for their freedom. Captive humans, how original! No island had worn captive humans for centuries. "Thrillstone," said one of the isles in a deep, rumbly voice. "Thrillstone," said another, softer. "Thrillstone," cried a third, in a voice like the boom of surf in deserted coves. Iris popped up beside the Thrillstone's left knee, red-faced and breathless, after her hasty swim from the reef. She pointed up at the isle and shouted, but there was no way she could make herself heard over the voices of the rambling isles. "Thrillstone, Thrillstone, Thrillstone." Even the one with the wig of whalebones, who had been hoping to win, saw which way the tide was running and added his voice to those of the others. "Thrillstone! Let Thrillstone be the winner!" Just then the song of the mermaids rose in a wild crescendo, and suddenly Iris saw how she might be able to save Oliver and his family, even if all else was lost. She took a deep breath and sang the same note she had sung for the merman choirmaster a few moments before. She sang louder this time, as loud and as shrill as she could. She sang till her face turned purple. Before, her voice had been enough to break the mermaids' mirrors. This time it made the rambling isles clap their hands over their ears and put the other mermaids off their song. Oliver, swinging in his globe, saw a fine frost of crack start to spread across the glass. Tish! Crash! Smash! The 3 globes shattered. Icefalls of glass cascaded down the Thrillstone's cliff. Into the sea dropped Mr. and Mrs. Crisp. But what of Oliver? Iris peered about, trying not to be distracted by the hoots of the angry islands, who were all outraged that a mere mermaid had dared to interrupt that solemn moment. Ah, there he was, clinging to a root which jutted from the Thrillstone's rocky forehead. But just as Iris saw him, a great smother of foam came down on her. The Thrillstone turned towards her, swirling the skirts of the sea. "Stupid fat mermaid, you spoiled my wig." Iris darted out of the way as the Thrillstone's huge foot tried to squash her. She plunged down under it, almost to the silver sand of the sea floor, and then rose up on the other side. As she broke the surface there, Mr. Culpepper came flapping over her, squawking. "Here they are!" She saw Mr. and Mrs. Crisp clinging together, tossed up and down like two corks on the waves which the angry island was creating. She seized each of them by a hand and swam with them to calmer water. But Oliver knew nothing about any of this. Clutching at roots and rocky pimples, he had heaved himself back up the Thrillstone's steep face. There he saw sea monkeys running in every direction, while furious Stacy de Lacy kicked them about like furry green footballs. "It's all gone wrong," Stacy raged. "We'll be disqualified unless—" "Grrrr!" roared the Thrillstone. Other islands blundered away from it, scared of its rage and the way it lashed its clumsy stone fists about like massive hammers. Stacy de Lacy scrambled onto his viewing platform on the island's brow and grabbed his loud hailer. "The Thrillstone is still the winner!" he bellowed. "You chose him and he won fair and square, and now you better do what he says or my monkeys will come and mess your wigs up." Sea monkeys spilled down the Thrillstone's face like a river of snot. They spread across the ocean, gibbering with wild glee as the waves lifted them up and down. But above the shouting of Stacy de Lacy and the roars of the Thrillstone, the hoots of frightened isles and the squeals of the monkeys, a new voice boomed out. "Stop!" it said. The rambling isles looked round. The monkeys too. Even the Thrillstone stopped roaring and glanced over its huge stone shoulder. Another rambling isle had arrived, a small and shabby isle, with nothing on its head but the sad remnants of a not very good wig, and a confused narwhal, which it just scooped up. At the sight of him, Iris jumped clean out of the water and turned a cartwheel above the Crisp's bewildered heads. Oliver, looking down from the Thrillstone's brow, grinned a great grin to himself and whispered, "Cliff!" Cliff stood up as tall as he could, and the narwhal fell off his head. He shook a fist at the Thrillstone and shouted something about stolen ships and kidnappings, but the surf was bursting against him, and all that most of his listeners heard was "Braggle!" Oliver, from his high vantage point, could see that the poor island's knees were knocking together, but still Cliff stood his ground as the Thrillstone, with seabed-shaking stomps, strode angrily towards him. Poor Cliff. All the way from the sarcastic sea he had kept telling himself that his fellow rambling isles would help him to teach the Thrillstone a lesson. Now he could see that they were all as scared of it as he was. As they edged nervously away, he realised that he was going to have to face it alone. Which was very bad, because the Thrillstone was bigger and stronger and fiercer than Cliff, and up on its head Stacy de Lacy was yelling, "Smash him, Thrillstone! Bash him up! Stamp him down!" "Leave him alone!" shouted Oliver. Jumping up from his hiding place, a monkey drum rolled past him as the Thrillstone lurched towards Cliff, and Oliver snatched it and flung it at Stacy de Lacy. It missed, but it made Stacy look round, and he forgot about Cliff and charged angrily at Oliver instead. Oliver ran away from him, zigzagging between the trees, looking for something he could use to defend himself. Near the pool by the temple, he found one of the peacock feather fans lying where a careless monkey had dropped it. It looked a flimsy, feather dustery sort of thing, but he picked it up anyway. That was when the idea came to him. He could hear Stacy de Lacy panting through the trees behind him, spluttering threats and curses. The ground beneath him shivered as the Thrillstone let out another cry of rage. Oliver ran between the trees to where one of those fissures opened, the cracks which led down to the island's hollow insides. He took a deep breath and jumped in. Dump, bump, crash! He went, bruising himself as he tumbled down through stony tubes and crannies. He snatched at outjuttings of rock to slow himself, and the Thrillstone flinched just as it had before. How could something so big and stony seeming be so ticklish? Oliver wondered. And what would happen when he really started tickling? He found a foothold, raised his feather fan, and set to work. The Thrillstone swung a huge fist at Cliff. Cliff ducked, and the blow missed by a whisker. The Thrillstone growled and rumbled, readying itself to strike again. But suddenly it stopped. Something was moving inside it, something that tickled It writhed. A shipwreck dropped off its wig and splashed into the sea. "Ah! Ah!" said the Thrillstone, or something along those lines. Another ship fell, the water mole this time. It landed near the spot where Mr. and Mrs. Cripp were treading water, and Iris hustled them aboard. "Stop it!" howled the Thrillstone. But Oliver wouldn't stop. Deep in the bad old Isle's inside, he tickled and he tickled, mercilessly jabbing his feather fan into all the cracks and fissures he could find, wriggling and jiggling it there. The Thrillstone clutched its sides and howled. It stumbled and staggered, throwing up sheets of spray, making waves which slapped against the faces of the other rambling Isles and rocked the water mole and her passengers wildly up and down. A stone head tumbled off the Thrillstone's summit. A few last sea monkeys jumped off the cliff like rats abandoning a sinking ship, cannonballing into the water. The ancient temple quivered, cracked, crumbled. Bits and pieces of it cascaded past the Thrillstone's face to smash into the water. Other bits of his wig came loose too, wreaths of seaweed, boulders, trees. "You vandal!" Stacy de Lacy screamed, dodging a toppling stone head and shouting down the crack that Oliver had vanished into. "You spoil sport! You're ruining everything!" Down beneath his feet, Oliver just went on tickling and tickling until, with a creak, a black crack opened, splitting the Thrillstone's summit in two. Other, smaller cracks spread out from it. Stacy de Lacy watched in horror as they surrounded him. More creaks and groans and straining sounds filled the air. The Thrillstone had quaked and quivered and shuddered and shaken so much that it was coming completely to pieces. Down on the water, Iris and the Crisps watched cracks cover the Thrillstone's stupid, startled face like a black net. Then, in a slither of shards and a cloud of dust and upflung spray, the rambling Isle exploded. For a moment they saw Stacy de Lacy clinging to the top of one great fragment, yelling as it toppled. For a moment they thought they saw Oliver tumbling free with a big feather fan flapping like the wing above him. Then the spray hid everything. Oliver hit the water hard as the Thrillstone came apart around him. He plunged deep enough to brush his fingers over the silver sand beneath and came up gasping for air. He trod water and looked around, while the upflung spray fell upon the waves like rain. There was no Thrillstone any more, only a few scattered chunks, small islets whose heads barely poked above the water, even here in the shallows. One by one they opened little black beady eyes of their own and blinked. They were brand new rambling Isles, bashful in the presence of so many bigger ones. Oliver laughed, swimming between them, till there ahead of him he saw the water mole, still just about afloat, with his mum and dad and Iris and Mr. Culpepper all waving at him from its upper deck. Iris pulled him aboard, and he ran and hugged Mum, then Dad. The ancient submarine was sinking fast, but Cliff waded over and supported it before it could settle to the sea floor. "Wow! That was really amazing," said a strand of sarcastic seaweed, hanging down in front of Cliff's face. And it sounded as if it actually meant it. The other islands shuffled closer, trying to look as if they had been right at Cliff's side all along and not a bit scared of the Thrillstone. Some mumbled that Cliff had done well, others explained that they had never trusted the Thrillstone. A few of the quicker-thinking ones scooped up bits of the Thrillstone's scattered wig and added them to their own, because it was pretty clear that a new winner would have to be chosen. It was Damboulay who was the first to say, "Thank you." She looked at Iris and Oliver, then Cliff. "Thank you. You have saved us from awarding the greatest honour of our kind to a bad creature who did not deserve it. You have been brave, while we were cowardly. What is your name?" "Cliff," said Cliff, blushing a bit. "This is my sea-wig," he added, scooping up the water mole and setting it on top of his head again. "The Thrillstone stole it from me. There were some other bits too, but they got lost." The rambling Isles all looked at him. The water mole did not look nearly as splendid on top of Cliff as it had when the Thrillstone wore it. The strands of weed which were carried with him from the sarcastic sea did their best to look decorative, and Mr. Culpepper perched on the water mole's bow with his wings outspread, but it still looked a bit shabby and scruffy. Even so, Damboulay turned to the other islands and said, "I think it is clear what we must do. Cliff is the bravest of us, and his sea-wig is certainly the most interesting. He is the winner of this night of the Seawigs." "Yay!" shouted Oliver and Iris and Mr. Culpepper. Mr. and Mrs. Cripp clapped politely. They were a bit confused, but they were starting to get the hang of things. Even the weed looked pleased. But Cliff slowly shook his head. "Not me," he said. "I can't hang around here in the shallows, being feted and fussed over. I don't care about the Seawig competition anymore. Let Thrumcat be the winner, or Dimsey. I have to take my friends home." Then, with all the other rambling R's looking on, he turned and waded away. Upon his head, Mr. and Mrs. Cripp fetched out their cameras and took photo after photo of the watching isles and the mermaids. But either because of some magic of the shallows, or because the cameras had been battered too badly during their adventures, not one of those pictures ever came out. As for Oliver, he just clung to the watermole's barnacled rail and stared, trying to take it all in. He saw the unearthly purplish sky and the pale sea, the white horses galloping in the waves' crests, the mermaids playing in Cliff's wake like dolphins. He saw the rambling R's in all their finery. He did his best to fix it in his mind forever, and unlike the photographs, his memories did come out. He kept them always, and they never faded. Not far away, a fragment of the roof from the Thrillstone's temple floated on the waves. Stacy de Lacy sat on it, bedraggled and alone, using another, smaller piece of flotsam for a paddle. He was paddling himself away from the hallowed shallows as quickly as he could. He was hoping that, if the sea stayed calm and the wind in the right direction, he might paddle all the way home. He wondered if his parents would have noticed that he'd been away. "Eat," said a little voice. Webbed paws appeared over the edge of his raft. A sea monkey pulled itself aboard and snuggled down against Stacy's left knee. He patted its head, feeling rather glad that he still had a friend left. "Eat," said another monkey, scrabbling out of the sea behind him. "Eat, eat, Eba, Eeple," said a dozen more. "No," cried Stacy de Lacy. "Back in the sea with you. There isn't room." But there's no arguing with sea monkeys, and the sea around his raft was green with them. They swarmed aboard. When there wasn't a single inch of bare wood left without a little wet green body sitting on it, they started sitting on Stacy de Lacy instead. And even when there wasn't a single inch of him without a monkey on, they took to sitting on top of each other until a teetering, bickering mound of monkeys was piled high on the wallowing raft, with Stacy de Lacy in the middle of it somewhere, still glumly paddling.